So John Elkann really pissed off a lot of Hamilton fans over the last week, and I was going to comment on it on the day, but then there was everyone and their mother jumping in with what I would call real journalistic reporting, as well as a lot of clickbait. And you know we don't do clickbait here. No, people accuse us of it when I have opinions that you don't like, but generally we don't do clickbait here. Thanks for backing me up on that one, Sean. But I do want to comment on it because this is an interesting topic that is really normal to Ferrari, where in some ways he kind of has a point, but in most ways he should absolutely be the one to shut the fuck up. So let's talk about it. This video is brought to you by checkmythumbnail.com, the analysis tool for YouTubers by YouTubers. Try it free today. So look, John Elkann was on a press conference earlier in the week. I've forgotten what it was for, something to do with Ferrari. And John Elkann, for those of you who are unaware, is the Ferrari chairman because he is the CEO of Exor, which is a company that owns, I believe, Stellantis, which is like Fiat Group and so on. And they happen to own a 24% share of Ferrari, so they've made him the chairman, the largest small shareholding, I believe. So John Elkann was up and talking about the team, and he essentially said the mechanics are basically winning the championship this year because they're winning the DHL pit stop award. They don't actually have the fastest pit stop, they're just the most consistent, which is great, but not exactly something to write home about. But the mechanics are doing a good job. I don't want to bash them there. And the engineers, who've clearly done a good job, and he thinks they are turning things around, even though the team has done far worse than it did last year. So therefore the engineering team hasn't done a good job compared to everyone else. And then essentially went on to say that everyone else in the team is a problem, namely the drivers, who should spend more time focusing on their on-track performance and less time talking, noting that Leclerc and Hamilton are both basically dissing the team, which they have been, and frankly, they should be, because the team has continued to fuck up, and Elkann has continued to fuck up. And I knew that Hamilton would talk out because what has he got to lose? But I'm kind of glad that Leclerc is as well. The thing here is that we have to look at the two sides of this, because Elkann does have a point. He did make his own bed and he's sleeping in it, and I'll get to that in a while. But also, in reality, he really doesn't have a point to talk about the drivers. Look, Elkann's comments have clearly, I would assume, mainly been around Hamilton's performances, because frankly, given the car that he was offered, Leclerc couldn't really have done much better this season. Leclerc has been on the podium repeatedly in a car that at many times has no business being there, and even when they were doing poorly, Leclerc still brought back as many points as possible. In fact, the only time that John Elkann could really diss both drivers would be after the first 4 or 5 races, where I think Leclerc did underperform, but rightfully so. He came from a car that was challenging for the Constructors' title last year to a car that has been absolutely nowhere this year, so it's understandable, with his heartbreaking once again, that he would take a few races to, I assume, drown himself in whiskey and burn some Ferrari flags. But since then, he's done a stellar job. So let me break this clearly into 2 sections. 1, is he right about Hamilton's performance? Because the answer is an overwhelming yes. So Leclerc has been doing a stand-up job, but Hamilton hasn't. And this is clearly where this is coming from. Because if Hamilton was doing a same or a similar job to Leclerc, then they would realistically be fighting for second place. So let me indulge Mr. Elkann for a minute. Don't unsubscribe yet, because I'm going to bash him and why he's wrong. But he is right about Hamilton in some respects. Hamilton has had what he has called himself a nightmare season. In fact, looking at the stats here, it's been quite a poor one. For example, in the head-to-head of qualifying, including the sprints, it is 19-7 Leclerc. I believe it's 16-5 in just general qualifying, and then you bring the sprints in and so on, 19-7. And I'll talk about the qualifying gap in a minute, because that actually paints it in a better light. But then when it comes to the races, it looks really bad, because it's 15-3 Lewis. They've had a couple of DNFs and so on. That's why there's less races, if you're wondering, or disqualifications. And then in the sprints, it's actually Lewis Hamilton 3, Charles 2. So in terms of race comparisons, that means if we include the sprints, for example, it's 6 to 17. Again, doesn't look great. But as I said earlier, if you come to the actual qualifying gap, which looks terrible at 19 to 7, the qualifying gap is actually on average 1.5 tenths, 0.168 seconds to be exact, which is nowhere near as bad as it is between Russell and Antonelli, for example, with Antonelli's first season, which is 3.5 tenths, or Tsunoda's first season at the new team, which is nearly 7 tenths to Verstappen, or Colapinto's gap to Gasly, which is actually one of the most simpler at just under 2 tenths, 1.98 seconds. So the actual qualifying gap isn't that bad. And in terms of the races, I think that's where this season is making that race stint look really bad for Hamilton, because sure, it's 3 to 15 in the races, and sure, it would probably still be 3 to 15 in the races, because a 2-tenth gap in qualifying can be the difference between the front row and 10th in this regulation. So I think it's made it look worse for Hamilton, but he still would probably have the same head-to-head. Made him look worse in points and gaps and so on. But in terms of the head-to-head, it's not as bad as everyone's saying. But here's where it comes to Elkan being the problem for me, which is we need to look at very quickly where Sainz was. So if we look at Sainz and Leclerc in 2024, there was a 14 to 8 gap in qualifying. Not far better, but definitely better. And it was the same in the races. But when it came to qualifying, Sainz was just 0.037 seconds off Leclerc. And in their whole time together, they were very, very even in a lot of ways. Leclerc was clearly the better driver, but Sainz wasn't that far off. Sainz was what you would call a perfect number 2. And yet, here we are. They are paying $100 million a year for a driver who's not improving the team and bringing worse results, and making sure that they are off their game when it comes to Mercedes, who will likely beat them in the championship now, which could have all been avoided if it wasn't for, and here's where we loop back, John Elkann. Because all of this is John Elkann's fault. At the time, John Elkann had 2 extremely competent drivers. He had a future world champion, if he has the right car, in Leclerc, and a number 2 that was able to stay that close to the best qualifier on the grid throughout 2024, and he wasn't that far off in 2023 either. He had Sainz. They had 2 very, very good drivers. They were going into a season where they were hoping to upgrade, which they inevitably did. They came second in the championship and pretty much fought for it. And they had a new team principal who was bringing the team together and allowing them to slowly work on things from a Ferrari that needed someone to just be at the helm for a long time. Once again, though, John Elkann decided to jump in and cause problems. First, he hired Hamilton as a project that he led. So any complaints he has now are on him. No one was calling for Hamilton to be hired. They had 2 good drivers. That's all on John Elkann. So if he's unhappy with Hamilton's performance right now, he has only himself to blame. On top of that, instead of the team focusing all their energy on their engineering, on everything else, he spent the back half of last year berating Fred Vasseur, who was running them towards a championship bid that they missed out on by, I believe it was 8 points. So that's all on Elkann. He took focus away from all of the team, made them have to defend themselves, made the team principal focus on defending himself and trying to keep everything in order while trying to keep an outgoing driver happy, all while the chairman was talking to the press, talking to the media, and causing a problem. This has probably been a rant of a video that hasn't made sense, but to sum this up, I'm not going to back up and defend Hamilton here because, yes, he's underperformed. But it's his first season. I think it hasn't been as bad as it looks on paper. What has irked me to the bitter end, though, is this is a team that has not won a single championship in 18 seasons now and has no and does not look like that's going to change anytime soon, because instead of doing what they need to do, which is putting one person in charge and letting them build like Zach Brown, Christian Horner, Toto Wolff, etc. did in the past, he has been jumping in and causing problems the entire time. So how about, to put this back into words that you can understand, Mr. Elkann, you focus on the on-track performance and let the team do its job and stop fucking talking. Simple as that. Stay out of it. Give Fred Vasseur the actual run of the team for the next 5 seasons, or replace him with someone that you're confident doing that in, and just shut the fuck up. Easiest solution. Subscribe.